Perfect. And I will just do the introductions. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. And thank you to all the attendees who are out there. I'll just mention that there will be a question and answer period. We will have the chat disactivated during the talks just to reduce the distractions, but we will open it up at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat for that section of the panel. And I'll begin today by just letting everyone know the title of this session is the Book Contributors Panel 2, Dialogue and Meditative Inquiry. And I'll start by introducing Dr. Vikas Baniwal. Dr. Baniwal is currently Assistant Professor in the Department of Education at the University of New Delhi in India. He has been General Fellow for his postdoctoral work at the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. The title of his talk today is Ruminations on Dialogue as a Form of Meditative Inquiry. Next, we have Dr. Krista Ritchie and Paul Stemler. Dr. Ritchie is an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Mount St. Vincent University, where she teaches pre-service teachers and graduate programs. Paul Stemler is a pre-service teacher with a previous degree in neuroscience from Dalhousie University, and the title of their talk is The Dialogical and Vulnerable Nature of Learning, Perspectives from Positive Psychology and Meditative Inquiry. And lastly, we have Rajean, Willis, and Laura Leslie. Rajean Willis is a doctoral candidate in educational studies at Mount St. Vincent University with a background in clinical social work. Laura Leslie is a veteran classroom educator who has recently shifted to school counselor for the Halifax Regional Center for Education. She is also a doctoral student in educational studies at Mount St. Vincent University. The title of their talk is Explorations of Trauma Through Meditative Inquiry. Welcome to all our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll just highlight Dr. Baniwal.
At first, there's the meditation.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot about the meditation. Okay, so sorry, that's Dr. Krista Ritchie. That's right? Yes. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I thought maybe there was a change of plan and I was good with rolling.
No, you're good to go. Thank you.
So I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing you to a meditation.
Krista, can you turn yourself up, please?
Krista? Yeah, your voice is not coming through.
Oh, no.
It's better now. It's good now.
Maybe I just need to be a bit closer. So I'm going to share a meditation that this is actually quite in keeping with mine and Paul's presentation, in that I feel extremely now. I'm pretty good at like creating a structured argument and sharing some ideas, but I've never led a meditation online to a group of people I do not know. And the one that I chose is deeply personal for me. The story behind it is my dad taught it to me at a time in my early 20s when I had some pretty complicated health issues and was recovering from a surgery. So I had considerable pain and I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. And my dad taught me this thing. So I'm going to teach it to you. It can actually take an hour or any amount of time you have. So if you are laid up with chronic pain, it's a great thing to do to kill time. But I found it to be deeply useful for me. I thought I'd share it. So this will be the fast version of it, but you can spend any amount of time on your own. So with that, I'm just going to wing that. So I'm going to invite you to, if you can, if you're comfortable, to lay down, but certainly to put your body in a comfortable position that's as open as possible. So no crossing of hands, no like kinked neck, like try to just be as possible. And when you close your eyes, and I'm going to close my eyes. When you close your eyes, try to find darkness. So I'm highly visual in my brain. And so letting go of what I'm seeing, finding pure black or darkness, whatever that shade might be for you, so that the space in your mind is dark. From that darkness, you see a tiny orange dot. Find the dot and focus on it. And once you see it, you're going to commit to it. And it has energy. And the orange color is very energetic. And you let it grow, and you see that it's coming closer. It's small because it's far away. So as it comes closer, you see that it's not a dot, it's a ball. It's a perfect sphere, orange, bright, sitting in this darkness. And this part might take a lot of time because this is a practice. I found it took a lot of work to learn to do this. So I'll be curious, maybe during the social, you can tell me if you got there in this brief time. So when you have this orange ball in mind, it's fully in your mind and you're manifesting it. And it's becoming real. And you're going to spend as much time as you want on it in your mind. But then the next step is to let it exit your mind and float just above your forehead. So you can see it and you're focused on it and its energy floating just above you. And now you're going to use this ball to scan your body. And you're going to feel every nook and cranny. The more time you have, the more detailed you can be. And the orange ball is going to collect your positive energy. So you're going to focus on what feels good. On your fingernails, your wrist, your toes might be wiggling, just all the little pieces that feel strong and healthy. And you're going to collect some of that energy into this ball, and the ball will get brighter and bigger as it gains your positive energy. At this stage, you could spend any amount of time collecting, right? So this could be something that takes you an hour or 2 minutes. The practice is really manifesting this orange ball and letting it float and hover and connect to your energy. Once you've done that, the next step is to find the space where you have pain. This might be physical pain, this might be psychological pain. The part of you that hurts. And the ball is going to float to that space. And it's slowly going to let all of that positive energy into that space. And that is a gift to yourself. And it makes you stronger. And that's pretty much it. I hope that was helpful. It's something that really can take a lot of time and becomes a lot more, for me, effective with practice over time. But if you didn't know about that one, now you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Okay, and we'll just shift over to Dr. Baniwal. Thank you. All yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For today's presentation, I thought that I shouldn't stay with the chapter only because anyhow, it's out there. So I thought of reflecting on a dialogical supervisor-scholar relationship. In my chapter, I had discussed my own journey as a scholar, as a student, of education and as a teacher about how we get engaged in dialogue, how I arrived at dialogue, how Kumar's meditative inquiry gave a lot of interesting insights to me about dialogue and the parallel that I found between them. So today I have decided that let's go ahead and think of something, maybe get initiated into the next project. So I intend to share my engagement with my doctoral scholars as I intend it to be a dialogical engagement. And in saying this, I understand that the interaction that I perceive to be dialogical may not be perceived likewise by them. And probably a couple of my scholars are in the audience right now, and their reflections would be interesting to be noted. Nevertheless, I would like to share my side of the story to begin the conversation. I would also mention some comments and feedback that I have received from my scholars concerning my way of engaging with them. The foundational belief with which I engage with my scholars is that the dualities of personal, professional, individual, collective, inner, outer, reason, emotion, they create more hindrances than facilitate the quality of a study or the quality of an engagement. So with this foundational belief, when I engage with my scholars, so the first task that I ask them to do, even before I decide whether we'll be working together or not, is to ask the scholar about their pain. I ask them to write the reasons for their pain and how the topic of their study has emerged from their pain. So the idea here is to articulate a personal relevance of the topic that they intend to study. The thought behind this also is that an intense 4 to 5 year long engagement is not possible without a holistic engagement of the whole being and that sort of investment by the scholar. It also sort of instills a sense of ownership in the scholar towards the topic. So while the work can proceed in multiple directions, the scholar gets to choose the one that resonates with them the most. And this brings in a conviction towards the work and retains and enlivens the motivation to work on the topic further. Also, this sort of personal relevance in a way counters the hierarchical power dynamics that are set up there, that are created in an institution which is rooted in the mistrust on the scholar, the assumption that scholars need to be made to work. So against that, such a personal relevance of the topic under study makes the scholar all the more ready to get engaged. So it's to ensure deeper engagement, but such an approach also brings in a lot of emotional turmoil for the scholar. To engage with one's own pain requires confronting it, probably reliving it, but also with that it brings in a hope to understand it better, if not heal it. So this method makes it imperative for the supervisor to extend the boundaries that the typical supervisor's role sets upon us. And the supervisor then has to become a constant companion and support while the scholar embarks upon the journey. Along with me being there as the supervisor, I also highlight time and again the need and importance of a community of scholars. Of course, the supervisor-scholar relationship is hierarchical, and there are some boundaries which appear and disappear. So for students to and scholars to do some sort of catharsis, have a brainstorming, have a more of experience sharing, and learning from other co-scholars, it's important that the community is there. Now, this whole approach, I understand, is contrary to the instrumental approach in education and research. Buber would probably call this I-it approach, where scholars want to do a study, to get a doctorate, and to get a job, to make some decent amount of money, so that they can live a decent, reasonably comfortable life. But this whole process is not with that intent. Yes, it will happen finally, but the process then has its own life and takes you in unthought of, unprecedented directions. Also, then if we embark upon such a journey, then it's important for the supervisor himself, and here talking about myself, to ensure a deeper engagement, to delve deeper into the scholar's area of study. So there has to be some coherence, some gelling up of my research interests with the scholars. And in this process, then both the scholar and the supervisor are equally vulnerable. Generally, the notion of hierarchy tells you that the supervisor is on a higher pedestal, the scholar is on a lower one, so the scholar is vulnerable. But here in a dialogical engagement, when you are opening yourself up to the other person, then you both are mutually vulnerable. Now, there are many things that help me in engaging with my scholar dialogically. And now I would fall back on the comments and feedback that I get from my scholars. So one of my scholars has written to me that your reflective questions are open-ended, which help us to explore possible responses and find links, connections, contradictions among the responses. And they give us different perspectives to look at things. And when we deliberate upon these perspectives, we understand the question more holistically. So again, yes, so importance of questions. That's the beginning, I think. Another one writes that what I feel is, as you have a background in clinical psychology as well, you easily are able to understand the way a person thinks, how the person's personality plays out into the argument, into the kind of the study that the person is trying to do. So by understanding from where the person is coming, you help us delve into multiple possible directions and then choose on our own. So this method then creates a lot of back and forth. It's not a very straight line of movement. So I tell my scholars that, it's not an assignment. Doing a doctoral work or even a dissertation in master's is not an assignment. You cannot know what you are going to get before you begin the work. So in that sense, it's like wandering, but with some tentative hints and pointers. So that sort of free space that a scholar gets, along with occasional hints and pointers, so that they can move around, and if they need some guidance, they can come up and ask for more. And there are failures, definitely, because often deep questions, difficult questions, they do create a lot of restlessness among people. And often it happens, and probably that is why I don't readily agree to work with a scholar that when you push people to think more, think about the personal relevance, then often people find that, this is not a path that I want to take up, because that's not the routine way that people do things. So they often back out from working with me, and which I really don't mind. So that's another, that dialogue is not always so rosy as we tend to think. There are always moments when you feel whether what you are doing is right or not. And because there is vulnerability, as I mentioned earlier, there is a constant doubt, not the kind of self-doubt that takes you to inaction, but a kind of self-doubt that keeps you humble, that it's still a direction in the making. It's always a journey, and every step has to be taken very cautiously and carefully. So these ideas like care, compassion, awareness, all they come up quite often in our conversations. Then yes, there are students and scholars who share that they have grown and they have understood the issues better, and that they are able to see the connections between their academic and personal lives, and how while working on their own topic of study, they have become better at understanding their own life and its issues. But again, as I say, that this is just an initiation into dialogue. So this relationship that we have, it's just an initiation so that you can walk this path on your own. I'm again reminded of Buber, who talks about dialogue as pointing the way, that you can only point, someone else can only point the way. It's you who have to walk on it. So that's another disclaimer that is there, that the journey is never ending. It's always going on. Also,
note you're at your 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Also, when you have this kind of a dialogue where the personal and the professional are constantly coming in, then having this, I mean, it's not easy. It's very tricky, because sometimes people feel that you are friends with them, whereas as a you can't ignore that the distance also, distance of generation, distance in terms of your position. So you are friendly, but you're also sometimes giving them direction. You are also stopping them, and then it's especially when you edit their written work, they see that difference. That how can you be so ruthless about the way we have written it? But that's the nature of writing. When we are discussing, then that's a different ethos, and when we are writing and evaluating how you have written, that's a different ethos. So these different moods are clearly visible in that space. So then finding depth in concepts, and a scholar uses the word life concepts, that since you are working on your own, sort of in on your own personal life, the concept that you study is not just a concept, it's a life concept, because your whole life seems to be revolving around it. Apart from that, I must highlight that the space in which you work, that is also very important. So my room, I mean, where I sit and where my scholars and I work, I would like to just share the space with you. Yeah, so this is my room. I don't know if it's visible now. Is it visible?
Yes,
we
it is.
So, and this is the other side of the room. So this is a space that I have and which is always open to my scholars, and that's where we work. So how even the space has an impact on the people and their lives. So yeah, I think that's all from my side.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baniwal. That was wonderful. And we'll bring you back in for the question and answer period towards the end. Thank you. And over to you, Dr. Ritchie and Paul Stemler.
Hi, my name is Paul Stemler. I'm a high school math and science teacher in Halifax. I'm presenting today with my colleague Krista. We met when I was in the pre-service teacher education program at Mount St. Vincent University. Though she was not one of my professors, we worked together on research projects in the areas of student learning, emotions, and psychological well-being.
We'd like to begin with acknowledgement that we're doing this work in Mi'kmaq, which is unceded land. We're also working in a university that was founded by the Catholic Church. The president of our university recently issued a formal apology for MSVU's role in residential schools that stole children from their families and resulted in innumerable deaths. We're acknowledging the attempted genocide of people in our recent past right here where we work. We also want to acknowledge the fact that children's rights are not upheld in Canada and across the world to this day. In Nova Scotia, our literacy rates are low and our poverty rates are high. Access to education or food are far from equal for the children in our province. In many places in the world, girls are not allowed to obtain an education or pursue a career of one's choosing. The rights that we have worked hard to win over time are being taken away with changes in political climate. We invite you to share in a collective awareness that we have immense privilege to be here today, having these conversations without fear of personal harm. We also want to thank everyone involved in the conference to date, and we look forward to our remaining time together. So to get us started, I'm going to unpack our title. I want to address what we mean by theory and evidence. To say it succinctly, and risk oversimplification, we posit that humans are capable of abstraction and complexity of experience and thought that often exceed our means for sharing or externalizing these internal processes. We see language, art, visual art, music, and numbers as symbols that can be used to exchange internal states with each other. In this vein, evidence and theory are externalized attempts at sharing deeper meaning. It is in the sharing, the dialogue with each other when we meet our human potential. As such, we identify as pragmatists. Symbol systems, whether they be qualitative or art-based or quantitative, do not fit within a hierarchy. They just exist. What we do with them is what can lead to learning and by default, help or harm oneself and others. So we're also elaborating on what we wrote in the chapter, not summarizing it. We took it as sort of a starting point. Reflecting on how this chapter that we wrote did come to be, we see it as just one deliverable from an ongoing collaboration that began almost 3 years ago. Written deliverables and specific conference presentations, such as this one, are brief documentations or artifacts of work that actually happens through dialogue over time. The ripple effects of our collaboration comes through in many ways, including our teaching practices, the questions we ask, projects that we pursue, and of course, written works. Our chapter focused on Kumar's writing about vulnerability and dialogue. Both of these concepts are central to meditative inquiry. These are concepts we hope to continue to explore in today's presentation. And the two objectives that we have are really to make the points that evidence and personal experience parallel each other in the fundamental truth that teaching and learning are deeply personal. And also to share a call to action toward incorporating inquiry into Canadian curriculum.
Krista and I want to identify that evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, and personal experience work congruently in telling the story that teaching and learning are deeply personal. Through frequent dialogue, we decided our chapter must include a call to action toward incorporating inquiry into Canadian curriculum. In our view, inquiry is the vehicle for applying evidence and personal experience into education at the ground level. Teaching, learning, and research are inherently dialogic processes. Conversations occur within the literature, between academics, between teachers and students, and between students. The objectives of our talk today are linked by the overarching theme that moments of vulnerability are nearly always those moments when we are in dialogue with others. This means that vulnerability is at the core of education.
Can I just quickly mention, Krista, when you speak, your voice is cutting in and out, whereas when Paul speaks, it's very clear. So maybe, I'm not sure if you can put your face closer to the mic or something.
Thank you, Bonnie. I was just writing a message to Christa saying exactly the same. Paul's is very clear.
Oh, fascinating. So I can't blame the MSView technology.
No, yours is clear now because I think you're
Okay.
facing computer more directly.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. The timeline here on this slide highlights a very small sample of written work that demonstrates how deeply personal teaching and learning processes are. These references come primarily from educational psychology and learning sciences. If you're curious about work that we read that shapes how we engage with meditative inquiry, please see the references slide at the end of the presentation for full details.
As an early career teacher, I have felt vulnerable and seen vulnerability in my students. From September to February, I worked at an experiential learning school on a tall ship. I sailed around the Atlantic Ocean, visited many countries, and taught biology and physics. This was my first full-time teaching contract. Before leaving to meet the ship, I read the impressive CVs of my fellow faculty members, which intimidated me professionally. Moreover, I had to live with my coworkers and students, so fitting in socially was also a concern. My teaching ability, interests, emotions, insecurities, and fundamental biases were exposed, and there is nowhere to hide. I felt extremely vulnerable in this micro community on a ship. This did not feel good, but that is okay. However, the close living quarters forced me, my colleagues, and the students to be social. We learned to transparently communicate our academic and social needs. This caused my initial reservations to erode and cultivated a close-knit learning community. Vulnerability was at the heart of it. Learning, both academically and socially, was deeply personal for me in this first teaching experience. When I returned to Halifax, I worked as a high school math and science support teacher. Vice principals curated a list of failing students, and I met with these students to fill gaps in their learning. I immediately realized that for every student on the list, the VP and student alike really only wanted a passing grade. Do anything you can to make the student pass was the frequent communication to me. Rather than making assessments easier or doing a student's work for them, I focused on establishing a dialogue with each student to teach them how to learn to be self-aware, to self-regulate, and so on. This has allowed students an opportunity to be vulnerable with a teacher. As I worked with one student, he frequently complained about being too hungry to focus, but simultaneously too embarrassed to use our breakfast program. So I learned to keep snacks in my seminar room. When he was hungry, he had them, the learning continued, and he passed his courses. Another student communicated to me they were too scared to walk to school because of bullying. So I encouraged administrators to bend the rules and get the student a bus pass. They came to school on the bus and passed their courses. Another student had trouble seeing her textbooks, handouts, and assessments, but felt self-conscious about wearing her glasses. So I encouraged her to only wear them when she worked with me. She did, and again, she passed her courses. My students focused on communicating their unique barriers to learning, rather than focusing on learning different forms of a slope equation, for instance. These are 3 examples from when a student was vulnerable. This becomes enumerable given the number of students taught. Learning is deeply personal, but can only be personal when a student has the space to be vulnerable and communicate their unique learning needs. From my experience teaching on a tall ship and my observations from teaching failing math and science students, I noticed that both teaching and learning is hard, but they are impossible tasks when they are not personal. Incorporating dialogue into my pedagogy has enabled me to co-construct meaning with my students, which makes it personal for all of us. So Krista and I wrote a call to action toward incorporating inquiry into Canadian curriculum, because inquiry facilitates dialogue, ensuring that learning is both deeply personal and meaningful.
Thank you. So, to be honest, my initial instinct when thinking about curriculum reform is a strong desire to flip the monopoly board and just start over, right? This is in reality a highly improbable goal to achieve. So I seek patience, understanding, and hope. My hope and trust that we can shift how we teach children and adolescents come through collaborations with teachers and pre-service teachers. There are so many people with insight who work with intentionality. One such person, of course, is my colleague, Paul. And through discussion with Paul, hearing about his work and talking through challenges in our teaching practices. In talking about mathematics and science curriculum in Nova Scotia, we both wholeheartedly agree that a shift away from a loose, impersonal collection of facts is needed toward a process whereby teachers' roles are to acculturate students, to be scientists and mathematicians. For example, understanding science comes through doing science and knowing how to think like a scientist and communicate with others to find interests, hone questions or hypotheses, and attempt to make sense of our observed world while acknowledging our biases, limitations, and chances that our conclusions are wrong. Nova Scotia is far from achieving a shift from the what to the how of mathematics and science. I know this because of Greg McLean's master's thesis work that I had the opportunity to supervise a few years ago. He studied in detail the elementary mathematics curricula documents over the past 60 years. What he found will likely not surprise you. The number of outcomes specified in these documents have grown substantially. Aside from quantity, the only other observed shift was from concrete to more conceptual mathematics concepts. Unfortunately, the emphasis has consistently remained on predefined topics or categories of established knowledge. Kumar's work would argue that we as a society are long overdue for a shift in what is prioritized, what makes it into curriculum documents, and more so, how we see curriculum as a noun rather than a verb. Kumar's work, Curriculum as Meditative Inquiry, explains that we need to focus curricula on awareness, identity, and dialogue. What is shared across these three concepts, awareness, identity, and dialogue, is that they are always in flux, and they're deeply both intra and interpersonal. When I read Ashwani's work, it reminded me so much of work done by my PhD supervisor and mentor, Dr. Bruce Shore. He, in collaboration with colleagues and students, spent much of his career aiming to understand and promote inquiry literacy. It is interesting to me that the foundations of Ashwani's and Bruce's work come from different educational traditions and schools of thought, but they come to the same conclusion. The topic of study doesn't really matter. Mentoring students in learning and taking on the processes of how we come to identify interests, ask questions, and engage in learning through dialogue is the curricular imperative. Paul and I would agree with Bruce and Ashwani that we must make movements away from subject-centered curriculum design and toward a combination of student and question-centered design, with understanding that the students and the questions asked are inseparable, both from each other and from the teachers and the broader community.
As an example of moving toward the possible, New Brunswick's Department of Education and Early Childhood Development is implementing a new grade 6 to 8 science curriculum this September, rather than many specific curriculum outcomes focused on science concepts. This new curriculum has 4 skill-based outcomes, which are meant to be taught in the context of science ideas. This brings the cultivation of skills to the foreground of learning, facilitating an environment of inquiry. Students and teachers work together to practice and refine the skills required to ask and answer hard questions. While tangible skills are necessary in science, inquiry encourages dialogue between teachers and students and between students. These dialogues are where the real learning happens. Students simultaneously develop academic and social skills by co-constructing meaning with one another. This curriculum makes learning deeply personal. We also propose that it is developmentally more appropriate compared to subject-focused curriculum, and thus psychologically healthier for students. We are sharing the links to these curriculum documents in the chat. As soon as we're done, I'll add them to the chat.
I'll just mention you're at roughly your 3 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. So in closing, we have 2 onerous slides here. We can share the PowerPoint with you if you'd like. To the readings that we listed in the timeline from over the past 40 years that shed light on teaching and learning as deeply personal processes achieved through vulnerability and sincere dialogue. Please be in touch if you'd like a copy of any of these slides or access to these readings. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to continued conversation with you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. And we'll bring you back in for the Q&A in a few minutes. All right, and next we have Rajean Willis.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm here today representing myself and my colleague, Laura Leslie. Her bio was read. She's not able to be here today, but I will speak about our process in creating our chapter in Dr. Ashwani's book, which is titled Explorations of Trauma Through Meditative Inquiry. And we were both PhD students at the Mount for the course that Dr. Ashwani taught us in the fall of our first year of the program, 2019-2020. So we, if you don't know about the inter-university doctoral program, Mount St. Vincent University, Acadia, and St. FX University are all partners in the Doctoral of Educational Studies program. And so Laura, her home university, actually, she just graduated in the spring, I believe, of this year. She was with St. FX, and my home university is Mount St. Vincent University. So essentially, we took the course as one of the mandatory requirements of the program, which explored meditative inquiry. And for us, this course was one of the ones that stood out to us in terms of how it related to our research topics, which I'll get into in a little bit, but also the style of learning and what we were taught in that course about how learning can be different within a classroom setting, for example, or some kind of educative institution, was that in the way that you can deliver or facilitate learning processes, it can come from a place of dialogue, and perhaps it should come from a place of dialogue and really exploring the ways in which we've been conditioned to learn and to understand certain phenomenon or certain ways of doing things, which often comes from a Eurocentric or mainstream way that doesn't always align with everybody's way of seeing the world or learning and doing things. So to speak from my own experience, I am Indigenous African Nova Scotian, and we come from a way of a life that is much different than the mainstream. So the previous presenters, they talked about, low educational rates in Nova Scotia for certain groups. And so African Nova Scotians fall into the group that would be identified as being very much behind in certain learning aspects as it relates to our societal and systemic educational practices within grade school. That then trickles down to our presence in the workforce, as well as our income levels and pursuing post-secondary, for example. And so what I came to learn in my background, as mentioned, as a social worker, which helped me to validate the ways in which I see in the world and the way I understood things, was that Afrocentricity very much aligns with this meditative inquiry, and that we start at a place that is very personal. And I love how you both talked about vulnerability as well, Paul and Krista, because learning certainly brings about vulnerability in many different ways. And if you're a student that comes from a background where you've been taught that you are conditioned from society that you don't belong in spaces where you're not represented, where you may be made to feel less than because society has taught us through enslavement, racism, discrimination, that you're not somebody that is as good as somebody else, you do become very vulnerable, and you become very protective of yourself in your learning, and that may manifest in many different ways. And so this is sort of what came to this idea that Laura and I both shared around exploring trauma and what trauma really can look like, and what has tended to be left out of this idea or definition of trauma. So in our chapter, we engage in self-reflection and dialogue with each other, drawing on Dr. Kumar and Downey's 2019 and 2020 work around dialogical conversations. And so we wrote our chapter as though we were having a conversation. We start off by giving our own personal accounts of how we came to know more about meditative inquiry, how it resonated with us as students at the time, and how we were able to use this dialogical way of communication to help to try to present or articulate our thoughts around trauma specifically, and how expanding our understanding of that has come through meditative inquiry or dialogical ways of communication. So we reflected on our own places of identity, our own backgrounds in learning, personal and professionally. And we also discuss, where we're going with our thoughts and how meditative inquiry can really be one of the pieces to the healing or the understanding of trauma, and its biggest and most expansive definition of what it is to us and what we're seeking to unpack and uncover more around trauma. And how it can really be a piece to how we work with students or with people in general around understanding the different layers that come with trauma, how we've known it or how we don't know it, and how we can come to know what it can be and how we really can see it. We use analogies. So both Laura and I chose to begin our reflections with an analogy, I guess. So I chose a braid, which is very unique to my culture in the sense of braids are not only just something we use for hairstyling, but it's a way of expression, it's an art. It's a way to use art and express ourselves, creativity. I use the concept of the 3 strands to talk about my personal, professional, and education and how they all weave together. And Laura talks about a spark and having a spark as an educator, following a tragic incident that happened while she was a teacher in her classroom. Not so much in the classroom, but a student, something that had to do with a student in her class, and how she began to think more about how to respond to the needs of students and to understand how incidents that have a traumatic nature can impact students and their learning. So when I think about my relation or my interest in trauma, I think about when I picture a traumatic incident in my mind, not now, but when I used to, it was often an example of something that didn't relate to me at all. It might be of somebody who had experienced, a sexual assault, for example, or a car accident, but I never saw somebody that looked like me in my mind when I thought about trauma. I never really thought about someone from my community. However, though, as I continued on my educational journey and I learned more about myself, even, but others in terms of how Black folks often respond to certain situations, our adaptive ways of coping, our ability to I have trouble with the term resilience sometimes, but I do believe that there are layers to that word, but I will use it in the context of African Nova Scotian people, our resilience and our ability to keep going despite things in our way, such as barriers, challenges, things really created to destroy us. We have continued to persevere and survive. And so I think about all of that stuff, and I've learned that, trauma is bigger than an individual experience. That may be what I was picturing in my mind. Trauma is racism that folks may endure once or every day of their lives. It's the implications of racism that they have to deal with, and other facets of their life. So, for example, someone might be dealing with racism in their workplace, but then how does that trickle into their household? Um, they may be frustrated and cannot express that frustration at work because they cannot allow themselves to be vulnerable because it may be used against them. And then now at home, they may be short with their children or impatient. They may have arguments with their partner. They may withdraw from community activities because they just don't have the capacity at that time to give, and give again. So I then started to unpack this idea of race-based trauma, cultural trauma. And I studied a lot of Dr. Joy DeGroy's work on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I thought, she got it. People who endured enslavement, who were Black, had definitely endured trauma. And the way that they were able to respond to the trauma was very limited. There was no opportunity for vulnerability. There was no opportunity for space to be able to dialogue about what had happened to them. There was no space probably to even healthily process what had happened. And so, yes, some people might say, well, this happened many years ago, but she discusses how the residual impacts of enslavement and the trauma associated with racism and discrimination against Black people can also impact the descendants of those people in today, in our present world. So Laura and I decided to talk about this expansion of trauma and how we came to this as we wrote this chapter in a conversational method. And so we took turns to ask each other questions around what our thoughts were in regard to trauma and how to really transform the spaces that we're in into more of a healing centered space as opposed to inflicting more harm onto the people that we're working with. And what we came to find out through this conversation is that this is really a practice of how we can understand ways in which we can use these type of strategies, like the dialogical nature of working through issues or things that present in the classroom as, like a problem solving type of methodology that we can begin to use to identify where folks are in their experiences that may involve some type of trauma, and to move beyond identifying the trauma and working with people to understand how do we heal and how do we create a healing centered environment. So our objectives of the chapter really were to expand our understanding of trauma, including cultural and intergenerational trauma. We wanted to use meditative inquiry and show it through this conversational example as an option for pursuing work and social justice from the inside out, and to also challenge mainstream ideas and definitions of trauma. As I mentioned, that's what came to mind when I used to think about what trauma was. And now my definition is different because I know more and I can understand it differently. And I would say for Laura, in conversations that we've had and through this chapter, for herself as well, she has been able to identify ways in which she can bring this expansion of the idea of trauma into her work, not only as a veteran classroom teacher that she called herself, but also within the counseling realm as well. And I know she does a lot of professional development with educators as well. We were just at a conference together last week where we were able to separately present on different topics, but still related in terms of the trauma piece. And, we draw on meditative inquiry as a piece to our learning and a piece of our sharing and teaching. So I think what's unique about our chapter is that we really come from a person-centered perspective, both recalling, reflecting on our own experiences and our own, journey to where we're going, in terms of our research interests. And as mentioned, Laura has now completed the PhD and I'm in my 4th year, just awaiting ethics clearance to begin. But as students writing this chapter, I think it was really a validating course for us to attend with Dr. Ashwani. And I think, if he remembers some of our work, of course, it was very personal in nature. And very transformative in terms of how we were able to take this methodology, this way of knowing and doing things, and apply it to our current situations professionally, but also personally. You know, part of the course, he asked us to practice different, you know, ways of doing self-care through intentional practices that can help to ground us and keep us going. And certainly that was very useful as PhD students who are balancing many different other things in our lives. And coming from a social work background, and as I mentioned, in terms of the quest for social justice inside and out, you know, that's very important to both Laura and I in our ways of understanding how to show up in the world in our professional capacities. Most of my work stems from personal experiences because of where I come from and who I am and my cultural identity. Hence, why I've chosen the direction that I have in terms of my research, looking at race-based trauma and the impact on African Nova Scotians. And I think, you know, we talk about ally in our chapter as well, allyship, and how important it is for folks if we're using techniques that involve meditative practices, or if we're looking at ways to bring dialogue into our spaces, then we need to understand parts of us that we need to have dialogue within ourselves around self-reflection on different things that perhaps we didn't identify prior to. And so that was a part of this process for us as well with Dr. Kumar, in learning how to kind of unlearn many things that we had learned in the past that were deemed as being the one truth or the right way, but maybe not for everyone.
I'll just say
We
that
talk about our learnings, as I've just discussed here, and I wish Laura could have been here so we could maybe share a little bit more on, hear a little bit more on her self-reflections that maybe weren't included in the chapter. But at the very least, I think for us, you know, being able to expand this definition of trauma is just an example of how we can begin to relook at certain words that we use within certain contexts, but don't necessarily apply it in its fullest sense in other contexts. So, for example, I also, in the chapter, I share an example of a young African Nova Scotian boy who potentially may have experienced some trauma in his life. And he comes into his classroom and his behavior may change a bit, whether that's withdrawing or maybe it's acting differently. So, you know, maybe he's acting out a little bit. And how there's a window of opportunity for us to be able to check in with that student, or to miss that opportunity and just, you know, assume that the reasons for this change in behavior, if you even notice there's a change, is for something that's totally unrelated to what actually might be going on with that student. And so unpacking this concept of trauma means to create dialogue with those that are having a change in some kind of behavior, or the ways in which they move around the world or in the class, for example, in the context of teaching, is that we need to recognize those windows. We need to recognize when change has occurred, and we need to take that opportunity to bring in dialogue and to discuss what is going on. And you may not always get that vulnerability and that expression of everything that might be happening, but you need to be able to recognize the window for that, so that if that student is in a position where they would like to share what's happening or what's going on within them, that they have the opportunity to do so. So I think when, you know, after we did this chapter, there was some time in between the course and the chapter. It just renewed our minds again around the concept of meditative inquiry and what it can do, how it can transform the world, really, when we begin to relook at the ways in which things have been defined, the ways of which we've come to know certain things that aren't necessarily the ways in which we need to continue to do or look at things. There's an opportunity for new learning, co-constructing, re-identifying, redefining. And I think that we sought to do that through this chapter. And I'm not sure if folks have read it, but we hope that we did present to you our understanding, at least, of meditative inquiry through the dialogical practices, and how we have come to transform our own life and learning. I have to cough.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. We'll just bring all of you back to the panel. And for those of you who are watching, please feel free to put any of your comments or questions in the chat, and we will try and address them.
There you are.
Okay, I think I've got everybody back. Okay. Oh, okay, well, I see a question right here right away. Lori Cook's asking, wondering what panelists might have seen about connecting Freire's conscientization with meditative inquiry.
Yeah, so Laurie, I have explored this point a bit in my chapter, and I think just to make the connection clearer, when we speak of Freire, we often ignore the community orientation and the Christian background of Freire. So I have connected and I have read Freire through Martin Buber. So Buber's idea of dialogue and Freire's idea of dialogue, they come quite close to each other in their self-reflexivity, in their addressing the lived conditions of people, and in deliberating upon the hierarchy and still exploring the possibility of dialogue within hierarchical institutions. So that I have explored in my write-up.
I could share just this, it's a great question, and it comes to mind, the conversation I had.
Krista, can you tilt the laptop to your side?
Yes, yeah. All right, close up. I appreciate this question because it brings to mind a conversation I had last night with my husband, who's in he's a bureaucrat, right? So he's in a leadership role, yada, yada. And I talked to him about the power that he has in the conversations that he takes part in, and that there isn't an equal footing, and that he needs to become aware of his position and the awareness of others or their lack of awareness and how that influences and shapes the conversation that they're having. So he's sort of working at point B or W when he needs to back up and get back to point A. So I gave him Freire's book and said, this is your next read. Like, you really need to think about this and be aware and be intentional in how you engage in conversations, and how that shapes the work he does is running an educational institution, Nova Scotia Community College, like doing that leadership work. So thank you. I think mindfulness and having that meditative state is point A in Freire's ways of having conversations that can deconstruct educational structures.
I would just add, in terms of the dialogical approaches in which we kind of focused on in our work, and what we took from meditative inquiry, is that you've got to be open to having conversations and intentional dialogue, I guess I would say, about your own social location and those of others who do not hold the same, and to be open to learning, which means that you've got to be vulnerable in your ability to receive information or feedback, as well as to help others to understand how to not do more harm to folks that have already been so very harmed through the ways in which our society has been created. So it's it's not taking things personally, if you're not, creating personal attacks on people, but it's being personal about your own learning and striving to do better. And that's what allyship really is about. Is trying your best to understand where you sit and how that relates to other people and where they sit, and how you can best support them in this life journey together.
Ashwani, did you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, well, I can briefly say something. Thank you, Ali. I have explored Freire's idea in the 2013 book as well, and I've talked about it in 2018 book as well. I actually loved Freire quite a bit because Jayashree Mathur madam used to have that we needed to read Freire as part of our BEd program, and I remember to have written a whole kind of an essay on it, summarizing the Paulo Freire's philosophy. But as I went on to study more deeply, what I realized was Freire, of course, is very good and very foundational. His work on consciousness is often consciousness of, rather than consciousness itself. And that's what differentiates Freire and Krishnamurti. So yeah, but the wonderful discussion. When I'm on the microphone, I can say a couple of more things. Then it was so interesting to hear all of your presentations, and Vikas and Paul and Krista, you took a very different route than not just sticking to your chapter. That was great. I'm glad that you took that. And Rajean, in your presentation, I heard so much authenticity. It was very heartwarming. Recently I wrote a chapter with a couple of doctor students, not a chapter, an article. And in that they talked about the experiences that you're talking about, being part of the doctoral seminar and doing that assignment. So we'll need to talk more about it. But thank you so much.
So there's a few more questions coming in the chat. One was for Dr. Baniwal. Why do you first ask your scholar students to write on pain?
Dr. Anurada, so many people ask me this question, and I have also come to rephrase it a little, something that bothers them or something that keeps them preoccupied. And of course, it can also be about something very abstract, like love, happiness, wonder. One of my scholars is working on wonder. One has worked on happiness, another is working on philosophy for children. And of course, faith, trust, these do come up when we write conceptual analysis also. That's an assignment that I give to my master's students. And recently someone wrote on prayer, someone wrote on privilege, someone wrote a phenomenological write-up on grave. So yeah, these kind of topics do come up. And again, the intent is that there has to be a personal involvement in the work. So the student who wrote on grave, her dog died a few months ago and she was grieving. So she came up with this topic that I want to write about grave and what it symbolizes for me. So rather than having a conceptual analysis, we changed it to a phenomenological write-up. So yeah, the nature of work may change, but this intense engagement with your own emotions, experiences, your own lived reality, I think that is something which is non-negotiable for me.
Any other comments before I continue on that? Okay, there's another question here directed to Krista and Paul. Could you speak a bit more about the new curriculum in Nova Scotia and teacher preparedness for engaging in inquiry?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll ask or answer the second part and then follow back to the first part. When I was a student in the BEd program, particularly in the methods courses, there was a focus, like the first thing we ever learned was how to read a curriculum document. So they taught us what are outcomes, etc. And then it followed by curating resources to match these outcomes. And what I found is that by doing this, we're using other people's work and we're just giving information that other people created to our students. But in this sense, I don't think it really encourages or prepares a teacher to teach in an inquiry-based way. And I think this because they're not meant to ask questions about themselves, like, is this handout a good handout to give to the student? So what I think we could do to maybe move forward is encourage teachers rather than curating your resources to give to students is to create them ourselves. And that will practice, or that will give us more practice to incorporate creation in our pedagogy and thus let our students follow through with that. To speak about the new curriculum, it's actually I was referring to the curriculum in New Brunswick. It's a time where we get to learn from our friends in the East, or in the West. That's worse. I was brought to this example because a friend of mine is an elementary school teacher in New Brunswick. And it was really clever. He was teaching his students about how to like create an experiment, for instance. And what they're doing is they're like looking at the most efficient fan design for like a car. So rather than using the engine, it was like a fan and there's wind, and they got to see how fast the car would go. And I thought this was really clever because yes, it's science, but it's really encouraging them to ask a question and then use creativity to answer it in a really cool way. So then I thought that incorporating this type of learning would be great into our Nova Scotian curriculum, because right now, as a math and science teacher, it's just a list of many, like hundreds of outcomes that I just have to hit. So I have to teach specific things rather than allow the students to discover what's really interesting about science.
If I could add to that, thank you so much, Paul. This brings to mind my experience during my doctoral studies. I worked with a teacher. I had to go to Connecticut to find a teacher who was doing truly student-centered, inquiry-oriented education to study it, but I found him, and we did great work together. And so he taught traditional biology, so followed the curriculum and did his job as he was told to do. But also through commitment to the high school and being a really effective teacher, the school gave him permission to do an elective course. And so through this elective course, he structured inquiry. So it was outside of the curriculum. It wasn't required, but it was where he could really manifest and create a different space and process of learning. And that sort of like summarized a bit in the beginning of our chapter, those stories about the high school science students. What was interesting was that his career trajectory since then, it was a long time ago, it was that in the States, you can have these charter schools. So charter schools they come with their own rife complications and weaknesses, but what it does allow is that you create your own curriculum and you get to design from scratch. So he now has moved from being a teacher creating one small elective course to a principal of a school where the entire school is inquiry oriented. So I bring it up because there are starting points. There are places where we can be learning the practice and the how and what it looks like in reality with kids, and then bring that into change conversations, such as what New Brunswick is actually trying to do, and what I believe Nova Scotia is not trying to do at all.
Rajean, do you want to? I know that you have responded to Caroline's comment a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about it more? Because I think folks might benefit from learning more about subconscious and conscious biases and assumptions.
Yeah, sure. I was just looking in the comments, and yeah, basically just to respond to Caroline there. Yeah, I think I say subconscious or conscious because sometimes we know we have biases and assumptions that we just aren't interested in changing. Or, something I think our tuition often tells us when something we say or do isn't always the best. And we sometimes ignore that. And then sometimes subconsciously, due to different influences that are external to us, such as the media, the people around us, how we've learned and studied things in the education system, for example, where certain things have been projected or portrayed as being the right thing versus the wrong. I think that those are kind of our subconscious things that we don't even pay attention to on a daily, but somehow they still spill out within us in how we do certain things or see the world. And so I was basically just saying, I think we need to create more space to bring in dialogue around the subconscious or conscious biases and assumptions that we hold as people. Because if we don't do that, then they just continue to stay and remain within us. And we don't have the opportunity to maybe in some cases even know any better because we're not opening up ourselves to learn any better. So yeah, I just think that it's hard work to allow ourselves and give ourselves permission to unlearn and relearn in a safe way. But I think it's necessary for us to do that and to open up space about that for transformation, social justice change to really take off or take hold in the world.
And any thoughts any of you would like to share about each other's presentation? Anything comes to your mind? We just have a little bit more time. We can finish early too, but if something comes to your mind, it might be good for the audience to hear.
I have something.
Direction of the laptop.
Oh my God. Okay, slow learner. There's a term in the comments about pedagogy. So I Googled it because I didn't know it, because we have so many words. Words are tools for communicating our meaning and what's intuitive or what we understand internally. And I think maybe it's just a different vernacular for maybe a very similar thing, but I would have to look into it to know more about how similar or different it might be. But I wanted to share some gratitude to Vikas when you talked about, was it called self-concepts? Where you say like, it's really like, it's the thing that's the core. Inquiry is my self sort of concept. Like it's the thing that at a time of trauma, as a young child, a teacher was willing to throw out the curriculum and the requirement to show up to school because I wasn't willing to, and engaged me through dialogue in an inquiry process. And I finished grade 6 and went to junior high. So I consider that a success because I, in grade 5, didn't think I'd be going back to school. So it really is, it came from a place of pain and difficulty. And inquiry was actually the thing that I saw and recognized as the solution and my way out of a dark place. And it's what I studied. So I think it's a really interesting way to coach your PhD students and find intrinsic motivation and true self, and to link that to academic discourse. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Paul. And Krista. So some comments before I come to the question. I really like this idea of space to be vulnerable. And I would like to share here that a student of mine asked me if she could sit in my room whenever she felt needed. And I readily agreed. And the student came and sat without talking about her concerns at all for a long time. And I mean, I was happy to see that someone could find a space and make it their own for, and without being asked why you are sitting here and being questioned. And so this meditative inquiry and dialogue, this is also quite contrary to the present attempt to professionalize teaching and education, and increase in surveillance and scrutiny, and to the extent that teachers are apprehensive of talking face to face, and for the fear of being misunderstood, they prefer email communication. So all this really reduces the possibility of having dialogue. So the dialogic moments that Rajean talks about, they are lost. There is no possibility of those moments to emerge in a discussion. And that takes me into pedagogy. So, see, education is a normative enterprise. Dialogue, in that sense, is towards, I mean, it's not instrumentally towards something, but it is rooted in some values. So, I think it's the overemphasis on learning what one knows. So on propositional and procedural learning, I think these are the only two things that we generally focus on and which become the basis of our educational objectives and outcomes. I think it's too much emphasis on these that the importance of those ephemeral and I dare say sublime moments of dialogue is lost. So heuristic, I think, is still better. I mean, where there's a possibility of guidance and engagement. But pedagogy, I think, takes it to a very cognitive level, where I clearly know. There's a very interesting book, Curriculum as Imagination, in which the author writes, if the student already knows what the student is going to learn, then it's a bad class. I mean, I'm rephrasing it, of course, but it's not a class worthy being in, because you already know what you are going to learn. So, yeah, that's all from my side.
I'll just add a little bit, if I'm understanding correctly here, but say in the context of performance evaluations, for example, within a workplace, whatever your profession might be, and professional development as being a part of that, in the context of where I'm coming from, being culturally responsive. I don't like culturally competent because there's problems with that term, but being culturally responsive, and there's certain self-directed learning that you have to participate in just to sort of check off that you've done it, but where's the accountability to what you've learned in a practical way, or the discussion or dialogue around it with your manager, for example, on what did you really take from that. So I think it can be like what Vikas was saying, you've got to have the opportunity for, I think, that give and take, that back and forth, the dialogue around what is being learned, what the task is, what are you taking from it. The self-reflection is self, but with self-reflection, you've got to have something to kind of feed into that, I think. So it includes other perspectives as well. And the ability to say things out loud, I think, is there's so much value in that. And there's even more self-learning when you can say something and hear it back to yourself. So we can talk more about that. But
that's wonderful. I think we are towards the end of the session now. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for sharing your thoughts. Would you like to say something, Krista, or you're just sharing material in the chat? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's lots in the chat if people would like to refer to it.
So do you want to conclude the session, Ellie?
Sure. Thank you so much for being here, panelists. Thank you so much to all our attendees. And we are going to take a quick lunch break and be back at 1 for the next session. But thank you again to everyone who's been here today.